Thank you, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started with the overview of the Industrial Commission. So I know Claire Vigasa had already shared this, but I think it's important to understand who the Industrial Commission is and what our roles are. So the Industrial Commission, of course, is very diverse, very broad. Like Claire mentioned, covers 16 separate entities, agencies. Industrial Commission is over 100 years old. It is made up of the governor, who is our chairman, the Agriculture Commissioner, and the Attorney General. And those three direct the work of the entire commission. They meet monthly. My role in the Office of the Industrial Commission is to, implement their daily work across all of these various agencies and entities. We have the Public Finance Agency, which acts as our bonding authority for state projects. They fund our SRF projects for water, sewer. We have the state-owned mill and elevator and Bank of North Dakota. Everyone thinks of the Industrial Commission as oil and gas. Certainly that's one of the largest areas that the Industrial Commission is involved with our Department of Mineral Resources. Across all of our various agencies and entities, we also have advisory boards. I know John Phillips is here. He sits on our PFA advisory board. We have 88 individual advisory board members across all advisory boards that advise the Industrial Commission on its various policies and help us to implement our work. So I know Claire already covered this. Really, the point I'm trying to make here is that we've known for quite some time that our grid is challenged. We are very concerned about the loss of baseload nationwide. The alarming rate of baseload retirements nationwide across the entire continent, which is estimated at over 100 gigawatts by 2039. Less than 5% of that will be replaced with baseload. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with what we mean by baseload, but if you're not, baseload is the amount of power that we can always rely on that will be there. Things like coal, natural gas, intermittent sources of energy, renewables, solar, wind, they rely on the weather to produce power. We cannot always rely on them to keep our grid going. Of course, we're also concerned about the shifting markets, ESG pressures in the private sector that are putting pressure on capital, putting pressure on our baseload power plants. We're also looking at the Bakken. Of course, the Bakken is responsible for over 63% of all state revenues. Funding for schools, funding for roads, funding for water projects. By the mid-2030s, without enhanced oil recovery, we could start to see declines in our Bakken oil production. And of course, we're also seeing great demand for low-carbon ethanol as well. So ag, energy, we're all in this together. I know Claire also shared this slide, but the point I'm trying to make here, with all of the federal rulemaking that's coming out, it is exacerbating an already challenging situation for us. Claire gave you an overview of what the RTOs do and what their role is. I would just add that, their stakeholders are very diverse. They cover a lot of states. They are very hesitant typically to make these types of statements. They're very skittish about getting out and making strong statements. So the fact that both MISO and SPP are raising the alarm, saying, US EPA has issued rules that are going to challenge our grid. The fact that SPP and MISO are saying that is telling. Like I mentioned, the federal rulemaking, already exacerbating our grid, which is already challenged. We have conducted a few studies, like Claire mentioned, through the Transmission Authority. What are the impacts of these federal rules on our electric grid? We modeled what would happen if the MATS rule, so the mercury and air toxics rule, were implemented. We modeled what would happen if the EPA's carbon rule was implemented. The results were actually pretty shocking. We've never seen a situation, like if you look at this graph right here and you look at those two lines showing, where demand is, where the power reserve margins are, and where power projection is expected to come from. This is a graph modeled for SPP if EPA carbon rules are implemented. We've never seen a situation where that line isn't at least somewhere within the intermittent. Here you're seeing we won't even have enough generation, including intermittent, to meet peak demand beyond 2030. What this means is over 5 million Americans will be without reliable power. We will have more hours with blackouts than without blackouts. And we've calculated what we call a social cost of blackouts. $83 billion in costs to our economy, thanks to these EPA rules. So why is this important? Well, in North Dakota, we're uniquely positioned to capitalize on an opportunity with CO2, really flipping the narrative on CO2, not seeing CO2 as a pollutant, but seeing it as a commodity, seeing it as a useful opportunity for our state going forward. We were the first state with Class 6 primacy. So Class 6 is the program that EPA typically regulates for carbon capture wells. North Dakota, thanks to an incredible amount of work by our Department of Mineral Resources, Lynn Helms, Kevin Connors, and many others, worked tirelessly for years, and we became the first state to achieve primacy over this program. We are decades ahead of everyone else in this realm. We also have a geologic jackpot. You know, we talk about our incredible Bakken resources, our incredible production. We also have incredible geology suited for carbon capture and storage. Over 252 billion tons of CO2 storage capacity here in North Dakota. So put that number in perspective. Our entire annual production of CO2 in North Dakota, over 4,400 years, we could store that right here in our geology. Up to 10 billion additional barrels of oil across all of our legacy fields, Bakken, if we can use that CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. Turns out CO2 is an excellent mechanism for pushing that oil out of the rock. Incredible opportunities there. Over $70 billion in additional tax revenues for the state that will help pay for schools, help pay for roads, help pay for water projects, more prairie dog funding. This is very important for everyone in North Dakota. Like I mentioned, we've been leading the nation the last 2 decades in CCUS innovation, so carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We've invested a significant amount of our state resources into this, but that's led to over $4.5 billion in private capital that has been committed in North Dakota to invest in innovations like carbon capture. Our stable tax and regulatory environment really are setting us up as the leader. You know, our legislature has passed tax exemptions for CCUS to encourage its development. Utilities are allowed rate recovery for any of their CCUS costs. We have pore space amalgamation with a 60% lease threshold, which allows certainty for companies looking to permit carbon capture in North Dakota. And of course, the Industrial Commission, through our Department of Mineral Resources, permits and regulates the operations, not EPA. I have here on the right-hand side a graph just comparing where North Dakota stands to the rest of the nation. Wyoming became the second state to achieve Class 6 primacy, and recently Louisiana became the third state. But of course, we are way ahead of everyone else on Class 6 injection permits issued. You know, North Dakota alone has issued 5 to date, compared to 3 in Wyoming and 2 in EPA. But if you look at the amount of permitted storage, it's really telling. You see that green bar there to the right. That is North Dakota's permitted storage total. 356.9 million tons of CO2 permitted storage. By far, you know, way more than Wyoming and EPA combined. We have long-term certainty in North Dakota with our CO2 trust fund that was set up by the legislature. We have a per ton fee that is deposited into a trust fund that acts as the state's insurance for long-term liability. If you have an in-state projects, we can charge up to 7 cents per ton, and out-of-state, the legislature has given the DMR the flexibility to determine that by hearing. So they can see the risk of the project and determine, based on the risk, what that fee per ton injected should be. Our commission sets by rule you know, how these fees are distributed into these funds, and the state assumes permanent title to that CO2 post-injection. This is long-term certainty for industry, long-term certainty for the citizens of North Dakota. Lynn Helms always used to like to joke that what entity would have ever been around for 1,000 years besides the Catholic Church? And I'm sure the Pope doesn't want to take on liability for CO2. So the state of North Dakota acts as that permanent title holder to that CO2. We know long-term we will have you know, security with the state of North Dakota, assuming that long-term permanent title. And with this CO2 trust fund paid by industry, we have that insurance and that trust fund to act to cover any future liability. So anytime you have a new innovation, a new technology, there's always fear and resistance. Any student of history can tell you that history tends to repeat itself. So I have a few examples of where this has happened in the past, of course. This going back to 370 BC, a Roman philosopher was worried about the invention of writing, saying that this invention will produce forgetfulness. Their trust in writing will discourage the use of memory, so they were worried that the advance of writing would disrupt our society. There was fear, too, when the printing press was invented. An Italian librarian said the abundance of books will make men less studious. They'll get lazy because they'll rely on their books. With the advent of cheap newspapers, an American author in the late 1800s said, and this one really sounds familiar, especially as a millennial. I've heard this a lot about our generation, but we now live and work at Express Seed, and we will be reading our newspapers. We won't be talking to our friends anymore. Our noses will be buried in the newspapers. Sounds like a common theme. When the automobile was invented, there was a New York Times editorial back in 1909 that the automobile is a menace. It will soon be impossible to drive a horse through the streets without fear of being run over. And I also have an example from 1997. In Mercer County was permitting a CO2 pipeline. Sounds very familiar to today. A county commissioner raised the fear. What is the characteristic of CO2 in a pipeline? I don't want a big old iceberg under the ground. So there was fear, there was concern. Of course, that never happened. That pipeline has operated safely for over 24 years without incident. But how do we overcome this fear and resistance in the face of new innovations? We have to lead with transparency and education. So a note on education. The legislature has already set up through the Industrial Commission, through our various research programs, our research councils, and all of them are set up very similarly. If you look in Century Code, there is a legislative intent language, starting off with, it's the Legislative Assembly finds and declares essential government function and a public purpose to educate. That has been on the books since at least 1987. Supporting our lignite education activities and marketing, which ensures that the general welfare of North Dakota through our lignite industry. Another example through oil and gas educational activities. And of course, through our renewable energy marketing and educational projects, our ag energy nexus, our biofuels. There's nothing new about the state's role in education. Now, I would say I prefer transparency. We've been receiving some feedback, from certain bloggers that, education, that means, propaganda. I would argue that that means transparency. We have access to this information as a state. It is our job to share this information with the general public and be transparent with our stakeholders. So with that context, this last legislative session, our legislature added a project to the Industrial Commission's budget bill in House Bill 1014. The project is for carbon capture education. This was to be funded 3 ways between 3 of our research programs. It passed the House 77-9 overwhelmingly. It passed the Senate unanimously. So the legislature acknowledged that we need to do more work on education as it relates to carbon capture. I will note that this funding is 100% funded by the energy industry. All of our funding comes from the energy industry tax dollars. Not a dime of general taxpayer dollar goes into this. Oil industry extraction and production taxes through their formulas fund all of our research councils, and then our research councils in turn are tasked with funding this CO2 education project. So what are our next steps? We are currently developing a strategic plan as it relates to carbon capture education. We've also developed and are in the process of refining a library of educational materials. We already had a soft launch of a website, carbonnd.com, that is a resource for stakeholders. We have been hiring consultants to do a lot of work with stakeholder engagement, reaching out to stakeholders, getting feedback. What are your concerns? We've been getting information out there on the safety of CO2 pipelines. What our plans are is that by the time the legislature convenes, we will have this library available. We will have a strategic plan in place to help guide us on the future of CO2 education and transparency in North Dakota. Our goal is that by the end of the biennium, we'll be ready to launch a campaign with all of these materials. That is all I have today. I will be around during the break and for the rest of the day, so if you have any questions, please approach me. All right, thank you.